What's up everybody, how's it going? It's Berk, aka Dansweight here, and welcome to this final episode of Final Fantasy IV, the PSP version, where I'm going to sit down and spend a fair bit of time kind of summing up everything that I've thought about my experience so far, and effectively reviewing the game for you guys, having played it for the first time. So this is going to be quite a long one. I think even compared to some of the others, it could potentially end up being really long, because it's been one of the more difficult ones for me to kind of try to summarize and conclude how I feel about it. It's more mixed than I would have liked, and not for the reasons that I would have liked either. So for me, in my mind right now, there's a lot of things that I want to talk about, and there's a lot of context that needs to be provided and discussed as well for why I think certain things about my experience and why I did experience certain things a certain way. So buckle up and enjoy a bit of a rambling about Final Fantasy IV on the PSP, my experience with it, and how I'm going to kind of rank it against some of my other experiences in the franchise and my overall thoughts about the game. But I'm going to go into, of course, a bit more detail here. I did share some initial kind of reaction stuff when I saw the credits roll for the first time, but I'll be kind of going over things in a bit more detail and bringing together a lot of different things I've mentioned throughout the playthrough. So let's begin. Like I say, first of all, there's a lot of context I think that's important for this game. It's one of these where the contextual aspect influences how you experience the game and how you perceive the game a lot more than maybe some of the other ones. And so I think, again, it's important to make note of all of these things before I start to really talk about it, both for myself and for you guys that are listening. This game was released in 1991, literally like a month before I was born, so it's almost 31 years old now. And since then, there's been almost an infinite amount of re-releases for this game. The amount of times that this game has been ported and re-released is absolutely insane compared to the other games. Everything from like the easy type that they made originally in Japan, then the version that eventually came out in the US was based on the easy type that they later made for Japan. There's been multiple PlayStation ports, there's been a Game Boy Advance version, there's the PSP version that I'm playing now, there's the Pixel Remaster, and then there's of course the 3D remake version as well. So it ranges from them being slightly different to very different across the board. So that's one thing that I think already sets this game apart from so many of the other ones in the franchise. There are just simply an incredible number of ways to play the game. And I think this is probably, now that I've completed the game, is one of the biggest detriments I think to the experience as well. But I'll explain more about why I think that later on. But for now, in general, I just think there's just too many different ways to play the game. And to me at least, based on what I've seen and what I've experienced and what I've heard, there isn't still like a truly definitive way to experience the game. So for me at least, when I was first deciding which version of the game to play, I was already completely overwhelmed by how many different variations they were. And of course, as a result, what I did was I sought out advice from people that I trusted. So I asked my friends, I asked people that I knew were experienced with the franchise, and in general, the version that a lot of people landed on and recommended for me to try was the PSP version. And a lot of people said that is pretty much the definitive 2D version of the game. Now, if already you disagree with that, then that's fair enough. But like I say, I'm blind running the game, and I don't want to research every single intricate detail to avoid spoiling myself about the games too. But for me, the primary thing was to try to experience the game in something that's more authentic to the original version. Because the first question you even have is, do you play a 2D version of the game, or do you play the 3D remake? But it's simply not what I wanted for the playthrough. Anyone that's been following the channel for any length of time will know that I'm working my way backwards through the games. Now what I mean by that is, if I play Final Fantasy VI, I've never played it before. When I go back to Final Fantasy V, I've never tried that before. So every time I take a step further back, it's a blind run and I'm playing it for the first time. And part of why to me this is interesting is because I get to see the origins and the history of the franchise. Final Fantasy IV, what I did know about the game is that it's held in high esteem by a lot of the community and from people that have been playing these games since the late 80s and the 90s. So there was a lot of respect for Final Fantasy IV, and they said that Final Fantasy IV was one of these games where, compared to the first three games, it took it to a different kind of level, and it really started to set the foundations for what came afterwards. So it's a very important game by that token as well. And for these kind of reasons, I wanted to really experience like a 2D, more original style version to understand the roots of the series and how things have progressed over time as well. So for that reason, I completely discounted the 3D version anyway, and that's not an indictment on whether the 3D version is good or not. It's just not what I wanted to do for the playthrough. So some people were pretty insistent on trying to pitch me the 3D version, but overall the PSP version was the one that was pitched to me the most overall. And also, if you want a 2D experience, I've been told by many people that it was the best way. It's got nice clean visuals, especially when you emulate it. It's got the additional content that like the GBA versions have, which is something that I generally appreciate as well. I want to have as much content to be able to play as possible. And I'll mention it later on as well, but I think, especially for Final Fantasy IV, that was a good thing for me. I did enjoy the bonus content the game came with. And so that's why I decided to go for the PSP version. But even starting out, there was already a lot of discussion and a lot of debate and a lot of opinions about which version to even play. And I do think that this is something that is not really helpful for the game. Especially as someone trying to come into it for the first time, it can really be overwhelming, and it feels almost impossible to pick a version of Final Fantasy IV that is optimal, and you're always going to be missing out on some other thing. So if you go 3D version first, you're going to miss that 2D nostalgia, the sprites, the original vision for the game. If you go for the absolute first ever version that was made, there's issues with that version of the game as well, stuff that was later tweaked and revised and additions were made to the game. And that's what I mean, like all of this kind of stuff, there is just no way to find the absolute optimum. So that's why I had to just rely on the experience of people that I trusted. And in general, I was always told that the PSP version was the way to go. So all of that is context of why I played the PSP version. And it's important because I think what version of the game you play can fairly significantly affect your experience. And that's something that I'll talk about more as I continue on. So as I said, I think for my particular situation and for people that have never played Final Fantasy IV before, I do think the biggest weakness might be the fact that there's just an almost infinite number of different versions to play. And having completed the PSP version now, it does feel like there are things that I didn't like about the game that either are better in a different release or completely a non-factor as well. So for that reason, it might be easy to just say, well then, if you didn't like this, why didn't you just play this version instead? But as I mentioned, I really don't believe that Final Fantasy IV has a truly definitive edition for the first time player, especially that's like objectively and undoubtedly the best way to play, and one that's going to leave you with pretty much no complaints about the game. I just don't believe that's true. Finding that absolute sweet spot I just don't think is possible for this game, and a lot of it will depend on what your own personal view is, what kind of way you want to experience the game, and what your personal tastes are as well. So I think that definitely made things a bit more difficult than I would have liked. Now, to put a positive spin on this, I do think that the variety of ports and the variety of options is actually good for second time runs. If, let's say, you played Final Fantasy IV a long time back in the day and you want to experience the game a second time, I do feel like because you know what the game's about and what you're looking for and what you liked about the game and what you didn't, I think you'll be much better informed on how to play the game for the second time. So to me, at least right now, having played the PSP version, if I ever play Final Fantasy IV again, the 3D version of the game for me is a no-brainer. That's definitely the one that I'd be going for, because I've seen the shortfalls of the PSP version. I've already had that original OG sort of experience with the art style and the gameplay and that kind of thing. That's sort of in the bag. I've been there and I've done that. Now, if there's a way for me to experience the game that's a bit more modern and it translates better into the year 2022 and beyond, then for me, I'll be playing the 3D version next. So for second playthrough, I might enjoy my second playthrough more than my first one, depending on how things go. But on a blind run in the year 2022 and beyond, when you're trying to decide how exactly to play it and which version, I do think it's not as good a thing that there's this many different ports and this many different options and this many different patches and this, that, and the other. So in that sense, it's difficult for me to call this like an all-encompassing quote-unquote review of Final Fantasy IV, because if you hear something that's positive or negative about the game that you feel is consistent across all of the versions of the game, then that's fair enough. But I think there's going to be a significant number of things that I mentioned throughout this thing that is going to be more specifically relevant to either the PSP version or to the 2D versions or to the original early SNES versions, and not as relevant to other versions of the game. So in that sense, it's just very difficult for me to really evaluate Final Fantasy IV as a whole. So I think that's why, like, if let's say you give the game an 8 out of 10, I think you've got to give like a plus or minus 1 depending on which version you play. I think if you play the version that suits you the best, you probably push it up a point, and if you play the version that's least compatible for you, you're going to push it down a point. So this isn't something that I really felt like I would experience with a Final Fantasy game, and I still think that it's fairly unique to 4 in that sense because of the sheer number of versions that it has. But I think that's how this sort of review is going to be, because there's just too many factors that are specific to the version I'm playing and to my own specific experience for this to sort of extrapolate out and be an overall opinion of what I think of Final Fantasy IV. So I think all of that stuff to me feels like it's worth mentioning before I even start talking about like what I liked and what I didn't like, because that stuff is going to quite heavily influence how the rest of the review is going to go. So I wanted to get all of that out there, and this should hopefully frame things a little better for what's to come. So let me get into the good and the bad about Final Fantasy IV on the PSP from my first time experience. So let's begin with the positives. I think for its time, and again, you're going to hear that a lot, but I do think it's important, especially in the year 2022 and beyond. The fact that this game is now 31 years old and counting is important, and you do have to factor that in when you're talking about things, because games have moved on a long, long way since 1991. So I think for its time, the scale and the ambition of the game is really impressive. I mean, I did feel like it took me on a fully fledged journey that spanned not only the world that we started in, but we had the underworld, and we even had the lunar ruins and like the moon and all that kind of stuff. So it did have a nice sense of adventure and scale and epicness to it at times as well. I feel like the Final Fantasies that came after it had similar kind of strengths. They often did take you on those kind of journeys as well. And I think this is one of the areas where it feels like so far Final Fantasy IV was the game that started to set those things into motion and really build that blueprint for the series of hits that would follow in the 90s. So I think that whole general feeling of adventure and scale was something I did enjoy for Final Fantasy IV. I liked Cecil, the main protagonist of the game, definitely more than I liked Bartz. Like, to me, Bartz is one of the worst things about Final Fantasy V, for example, the one that came after. But for Final Fantasy IV, I thought Cecil was really good. Again, he's a product of his time in terms of how quality the writing is, and I feel like in some moments of the story he doesn't quite shine through or have that punch or that emotion or that aggression or that epicness to give him that sort of elevated sense of cool and awesomeness. But I think in general he's a more than serviceable leading man. I think he's got a cool look, he's got a pretty nice backstory with his time as a Dark Knight and then turning into a paladin. He's got fairly complex relationships that we're aware of, so for example his relationship with Cain, and then he's got the one that he's unaware of with Golbez later on in the story. There's a bit more mystery to his backstory about who he truly is, you know, whose son is he, who is he related to, what is his ancestry. He has his little love story with Rosa. So in general I do think that Cecil was a pretty good effort as a leading man, and I did enjoy him. And I think he was definitely a positive about the game. So leading on from Cecil, I'd have to say that one of the things I truly enjoyed the most about this game, and that spoke to me the most, was that they manifested the story and what goes on in it into the gameplay in a way that I felt was pretty unique even later on in the franchise. So two quick and easy examples I think are of course Cecil with his Dark Knight story and the Dark Knight gameplay, because as a result his moveset, the things he can equip, all of that kind of stuff is different. But then eventually as a result of the story he transforms into a paladin. That transforms his look, the things that he can use in battle, his equipment, and all of that kind of stuff. So it was a really nice momentum shift, because not only did it shift the momentum in the story and the direction, but it also translated into gameplay, which I think made it even more meaningful and strong as well. So that's something I genuinely appreciated a lot, and it's something that I can't really recall seeing too much of later on in the franchise as well. I thought it was really well done. The second example is for Rydia and her fear of fire. Now this one is more subtle, but I think again that subtleness was another indication of how much thought they put into it and how smart they were in implementing this particular aspect too. So you can literally see the trauma in her life and the moment where her village gets burned, her town gets burned, so she develops this obvious fear and phobia of fire. And you see that happening, but then you also see that manifest in the story where she's unable to use fire magic despite being such a powerful mage. and being able to use all of the other spells. So it's something fairly small, but I just love the way that what happened in the world and in the story also translated into the gameplay and into how the characters do their thing in battle and in gameplay too. So I thought that was a really nice plus, and it definitely was something special for me for Final Fantasy IV. I think the rest of the cast was really likable too. We had a pretty big cast. I mean, it felt more like Final Fantasy VI in terms of the cast size, when you think of how many players were literally playable throughout the experience. They had a pretty nice mixture of characters and personalities. I think highlights for me were probably Palom and Porom. I love those two. Especially, I think, with these older Final Fantasies, I always love it when they inject a little bit more of that humor and that charm, because it's so difficult, I think, because of the visual limitations, to really inject like some more of that heavy emotion into games and some of that humor and that kind of stuff. You have a lot less to work with, but I think you can win some points back by increasing the amount of charm and the amount of sort of snappiness, wittiness, humor, and that kind of thing. Final Fantasy VI, I think, was where they peaked in that sense for like retro Final Fantasy, for pre-PS1 Final Fantasy. I think Final Fantasy VI got that the most right, and that's why 6 is held in such high regard for me. But I think compared to Final Fantasy V, 4 had the better cast, and I did find it more fun and charming overall compared to 5. The first half of 5 was up there as well for me when Galuf was in the party. They really, the amount of, I think, charm and banter and humour was definitely more when Galuf was in the game. But looking at it overall, I think Final Fantasy IV was definitely successful in that regard. The rest of the cast, you know, people like Rydia, Edge, Cid, Yang, Rosa, Teller, they were all like welcome additions to the story. I didn't really dislike any of them. I think Edward, they didn't implement him in the story quite so well. He's the one that felt like almost a bit of a waste of a character sometimes. I did later find out that he does have some pretty cool like abilities in terms of being able to hide and that kind of thing. But in terms of the story, I felt like they kind of took him out fairly early and they kind of left him on the sidelines for way too much of the story. So Edward was a bit like hit and miss. I didn't really feel like I had enough from him to enjoy him. But someone like Teller, for example, even though he wasn't in the story for that long, his kind of slightly crazy style, and of course like the line that he says to Edward, like, "You spoony bard," all of that stuff is pretty memorable. And even Teller for me remains a memorable character, even though we didn't really see him for basically the majority of the story. So Edge lived up to his name. When he came in later on, he did add a bit more of a youthful edge, a bit more of that self-assured, cocky, arrogant style. He had an interest in Rydia as well, which spiced things up a little bit. So honestly, all in all, I think the cast was definitely strong, and it's another like legit positive point, I think, for the story. So I did appreciate that a lot. I'd say the overall story and the antagonistic side, I don't think were as strong as some of the previous aspects I've mentioned, but they weren't a negative, they didn't detract from the experience. Golbez was fairly kind of prototypical, I guess, in his look and like what he says and what he does. But his plot twist later on was definitely pretty cool. I didn't really expect that. I was expecting Golbez to die or something, or some other revelation to happen. But that whole like brother situation with Cecil was definitely something that caught me a little bit off guard. So I think that was pretty cool. The way it ended up with Zemus and Zeromus it didn't really seem quite as convincing to me. I think again it's a personal thing. I've never really been as much of a fan of like the abstract entities of pure evil in Final Fantasy that are sort of just trying to gain power over the universe, or they've been around since the dawn of time and they're this manifestation of everything that's dark and evil and that kind of thing. I tend to prefer more human manifestations of evil. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like a humanoid shape or form, but like their motivations, their feeling, their history, their humanity, and that kind of thing. That's the kind of thing I tend to prefer. So I'd rather fight like Kefka turning into his final form for the boss battle, or Sephiroth, One-Winged Angel, Final Fantasy VIII Ultimecia. So that's the kind of thing that I tend to prefer. What I like less is more like Final Fantasy IV with like Zemus, Zeromus. We had like, for example, Necron coming in at the end of Final Fantasy IX. So in that sense, I don't think it was quite as strong. But overall, I would say that like the twists and turns that the story took, and the antagonists, and the general feeling of getting towards the end of the story and facing this big, powerful evil entity and trying to overcome that and everything that happened as a result of that. I still think it was satisfying and I still definitely enjoyed it. But I think the main positive side of the story was to do with the characters and the cast more so for me than the overall story and the antagonistic side. But again, in terms of the overall story itself, I did like the fact that pretty much there was always a significant amount of cast members involved. It felt like a pretty busy story. Like there was always something moving along. There was always characters coming in and out. And as I'll later mention, that wasn't always a good thing, but there was good aspects of it too. I think it helped a little bit with the pacing. To me, it kind of just felt like things were always sort of moving along. We always had characters around us, something was always happening. And so in general, I felt like the pacing was pretty decent, and story-wise, I don't really feel like it slumped really that much through the game. So I thought it was pretty cool. I would say it had strong, like, general themes of everyone having evil within them. You know, that's just a part of being a human being and having like a heart and soul. But within us, all of us, there is good too, and letting that prevail is always a strong message. It's timeless, and when it's done well, it always works. And in this story, of course, we have a very obvious sort of transformation from a Dark Knight to a Paladin. Then we have what happens with Cain and Golbez and all of that kind of stuff. So these ideas of forgiveness and redemption and having faith in the ability to triumph against all the odds, they're all things that we become a bit more used to, obviously, as we play through the franchise. But again, Final Fantasy IV, 1991, continuing to sow the seeds after the first 3 games had already done to some extent, I'm sure, for what we were going to see in the future. So definitely enjoyed those general themes of the game as well, and they always translate well for me in these stories. I think the PSP version shone in terms of its look. I mean, it looked really clean on the emulator. The general art style is already nice, but the PSP version did add some nice visuals, like the animations look really cool. The sprite work that they did was nice. Albeit Cecil having short hair in battle was always a bit weird to me. I never understood that. I later found out that there was a mod to replace that, so he had long hair in the battle too, but I kind of found out too late. But I mean, that's just one thing, I guess. But in general, I think in terms of visuals, I definitely give the PSP version credit. It looked like a nicer version of a Pixel remaster or something like that. I mean, the Pixel remaster does it pretty nice anyway. But I think the PSP version was a nice remaster, and especially like the summons and the animations. You know, all of these. Thinking back to like the big moves, like I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? Deluge, and like all of the big spells and that kind of stuff. I thought it looks really nice. So that's definitely something that was a plus for me. I think the music was, as always, strong. I say that about pretty much every Final Fantasy, but this one, I think, again, considering it's one of the earlier Final Fantasies as well, it's definitely still up there. It's not quite as good for me as Final Fantasy VI soundtrack, but it's not a million miles away. The final battle theme, you can always kind of generally tell if a game has a good soundtrack from how good the final theme is. And the final battle theme was definitely good against Zeromus. I actually like the main battle theme too. I mentioned it a few times in the playthrough. I never really got tired of it, despite literally having an infinite amount of encounters. I still enjoyed it. And the character themes too, like the Rosa/Love theme was good. Rydia's, Cid's, definitely overall was a bit more of a kind of simplified kind of thing. Like when you go on Spotify, a lot of the tracks like 1 minute long or something. But again, considering its time and considering the kind of tools that they had to work with, of course Uematsu was doing his thing. And it's a really cool soundtrack, as always. It almost never disappoints. Gameplay-wise, it was still the kind of, I guess, situation where I was sufficiently familiar with the overall gameplay. As I'm going to talk about later on, there's a lot of kind of quirky and different stuff, but the overall system, obviously, the overall menu and the ATB, and so obviously it didn't feel like I was playing something radically different to what I'd experienced. But those quirks kind of started to add up in ways that made me get a lot more things wrong than I assumed I would. But I'll leave that kind of stuff until later. The game offering the speed setting was always a good thing. It's basically, to me, it felt more like a difficulty slider for this one. And the more you slow it down, the easier the battles become. And it did make a pretty big difference. I remember at the start of the game, I was getting like 2, 3, 4 turns sometimes against an enemy, and then I sped it up, and then things started to get much more balanced. So The PSP version, of course, had some quality of life improvements which were useful. Things like the bestiary, of course, is always very useful. But the amount of enemies, I would say, the enemy variety was pretty good. Didn't feel like there was a crazy amount of recycled stuff. And the boss battle variety and all of that kind of stuff. Considering how old the game was, once again, and the limited scope they had compared to later releases, I think there were plenty of enemies and bosses to fight as well. I would say the characters having fairly defined roles was also pretty nice. I generally tend to prefer it when characters have a bit more of a focus on roles. One criticism I did have of Final Fantasy VI was that it kind of felt like they didn't kind of specify enough which character had which role. And especially as you get later on in the game, you could kind of have all of the characters doing exactly the same thing, even within the story. Like, you didn't have to get to like post-game mode and grind everyone out to make everyone the same. It seemed like they just didn't do enough to give people well-defined roles. So Final Fantasy V literally had a job system, which I really enjoyed, and I do think the gameplay of 5 is probably my favourite out of 4, 5, and 6. But with 4, it at least had the roles. You know, you had your white mage, you had your paladin, you had your ninja, you had like black mage, you had the summoner. So I think in that sense it was pretty good as well. I did appreciate that, rather than everyone kind of overlapping everyone's roles and it not really becoming very clear. And it's also a way to become OP as well, I think. If you, let's say, find something, like in Final Fantasy VI, the magic was pretty damn broken, especially near the end of the game, you could pretty much get multiple people spamming magic easily in the game. Now with Final Fantasy IV, even getting 2 white mages was pretty much not a thing. If you don't include the extra content where you can bring Palam and Porum back in, basically for the final boss battle you can't have 2 pure white mages in the party. So in that sense it adds to a little bit of the challenge, and it keeps you a bit more on your toes and forces you to think a bit differently as well. So I did appreciate that too. Final thing I would say is for the PSP version, well, GBA/PSP version, I did enjoy the extra content in the game. I think Final Fantasy V was a bit lackluster, as was 6. Final Fantasy V was probably a bit better than 6, I think. But 6's extra content, I think, was lazy. Way too much just repeating dragons constantly. And again, I'm less of a fan of let's just throw you into a giant maze with 25 rooms and hope that you can just figure out how to navigate it all. And we'll throw in tons of random encounters as well. And we'll have a bunch of dragons scattered around it as well. Good luck. Like, for me, I preferred what they did with Final Fantasy IV, where each character had their own trial. It felt like a meaningful effort to try and make it specific to each character, and we got to use them a bit more frequently. We got to get unique items for them. We got to experience some different stories, like the Cain one, for example, was pretty interesting to me. And so I felt like it was definitely a good effort for the extra content as well, and it was definitely worthy extra content too. So that's the final thing I'll mention about the good side of Final Fantasy IV on the PSP. Now let's move on to the things that I struggled more with and that I enjoyed less. I think in terms of the story, I would say the main gripe I had was there was a little bit too much back and forth with the characters. I did enjoy the fact that it was a fairly big cast, but again, I don't think they really got that stuff right until Final Fantasy VI. With this one, there was too much, like, I just didn't know who my main party was, and I just couldn't understand, you know, who was coming, who was going, and that does add an element of more kind of unpredictableness, but I don't think that always serves the game in a positive way. Even in terms of gameplay, you don't really know who's going to be there in 3 hours' time, and I think they kind of overdid it a little bit with the people coming and going constantly. So that's one thing I didn't like as much. In that same vein, ultimately I think they went for a bit too much in terms of fake outs and resurrections, and, you know, Cain and his constant flip-flopping, people that you thought died and suddenly everyone comes back, to which by the end of the game basically it was only Teller that was dead by the end of the PSP version. So it looked like we had about 3 or 4 characters died and basically all of them came back. So in that sense they kind of overplayed it a little bit. If you do something a bit too much in that sense, I think it loses its effect. So Final Fantasy V, spoilers if you haven't played it, but like what happens to Galuf in Final Fantasy V is very, very significant, and it hits hard. And what we know, like, you know, of important deaths that happen in the Final Fantasy franchise. But I think 4, in that sense, they just overdid it. And so I think that they needed a bit more time to sort of get that right. But I think by Final Fantasy VI, you see an example of them getting that stuff much more right and dealing with having like a really big cast while continuing to keep the pacing on point and keep things kind of rolling in the right way, and implementing such a big cast in a good way into such a big story. So I think that stuff did annoy me a little bit, especially with Kain. I think Kain was the most noticeable one, the way he just constantly just kept going in and out of the story and flip-flopping between good and evil, and they're like, no, you can trust me this time, I'm fine, I'm myself again, and then he looks like he's not. It was just too much for me at some point. But it's not, again, it wasn't like horrible, it didn't make the story crap or anything, but to me it did become noticeable in the end. As mentioned, I think Zeromus was a little bit weak for me. This is a bit more, again, personal taste. Not quite like Necron in Final Fantasy IX. We did have ourselves introduced a bit more to Zenus and Zeromus earlier on, but I think for me it just didn't do it. I still prefer that sort of human kind of element instead of these all-powerful entities just spewing stuff about, you know, evil prevails and everything is evil, everything will descend into evilness, everything will succumb to evilness, my evilness will take over the entire universe, blah 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 blah. So in that sense, that it didn't quite do it for me. It came in like later on in the story as well, so it didn't really have that great a build-up either, in my opinion. So yeah, in that sense, I think Zeromus, even though the final boss battle was pretty fun as well with the theme and all that kind of stuff, it wasn't up there, I think, as a particularly great antagonistic figure and story to end the game with. So Zeromus, I think, was a little bit of a negative for me. So with all that said, I think that's mostly what I want to say about the story and the cast and that kind of thing. I didn't really have any major issues. All of the stuff that I've listed, like they're gripes, but they're nothing that I think had a detrimental effect on the game for me. I think in terms of the story, the cast, and the world and the way everything played out, all in all, I think it's a strong positive still, and I put it up there with the really good Final Fantasies. So in that sense, there wasn't really any major trouble. But of course, we're going to come to the main, more serious issues that I had with the playthrough. I'm going to try my best not to be too negative and too ranty here, because again, there is a lot of context involved here, and what I experienced in this playthrough is unlikely to translate to your experience, either the experience you've already had or the experience that you might have when you play the game yourself. So because I think so much of it is personal in this sense, don't take this as too harsh a review on the gameplay of Final Fantasy IV or the PSP version. But I am, of course, always going to share what I feel and what didn't go right for me and what I didn't enjoy as much, and you can do with that information as you wish. It's my job to just put it out there and tell you guys how I feel. So let's go through some of the gameplay stuff that really just annoyed me. The first trouble I had, I think, was to do with playing all of the other games before playing Final Fantasy IV. I think this is a fairly unique position to be in, especially in the year 2022. I think most people would have played Final Fantasy IV at some point, or they would have played all of the more modern Final Fantasies and they don't really want to go back to Final Fantasy IV because it's just too old. There's not that many people like me that are kind of going back incrementally through history and playing each one for the first time. This, of course, means I have a really strong built-up set of assumptions and muscle memory and quote-unquote brain memory, I guess, just things that I'm used to, that over thousands of hours of playing the franchise, that are just, that's the way it is for me. So even something as simple as like, what is a light curtain, what is a lunar curtain? There's no way anyone could convince me that a light curtain is anything other than protect, right? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And this is not the kind of thing that I'm going to go in and research for this playthrough. I'm not literally going to run through the entire list of items and make sure they are what I think they are. As someone who's played so much Final Fantasy, I'm just going to go in and play and trust my instincts and my assumptions built up across the franchise to be able to get through the game and to be able to understand and intuit what's going on as I play. Now, for the most part, of course, I obviously got through the game, and it's not like I struggled particularly with anything. I mean, there were barely any game overs in the entire game. So in terms of like how difficult I made it for myself, I don't think I really made it that difficult for myself. One example where I did, of course, was like Bahamut's Mega Flare, which was just hilarious because it could be reflected. Again, there is no Final Fantasy that I know of after Final Fantasy IV where you can just reflect Mega Flare back and just do that. So there is just no way. I could have tried that battle a million times and I would never, ever, ever have thought to use Reflect on Megaplay. It just wouldn't have happened. So that's an example of where I made it much harder for myself. But it's one of these things where it's not my fault really, and it's not the game's fault either. So that's why it's so difficult to review it in that sense. So there are going to be things here that pretty much almost completely down to me and my own experiences. But I think it's also relevant to talk about them because they're things that didn't make it through to the later games in the series. And that's why I think, yes, of course, an important part of it is to do with me, but there must also be some other people that actually made the game that realized that this probably wasn't the best way to proceed when continuing the franchise. So I do feel like there is some merit in some of the things I didn't like. So let's go through some of them. The first one I would say is the way that Protect and Shell have to stack to be effective was something, again, I had no idea about. And again, part of that is on me, right? I didn't research it, I didn't know, and when you use it in battle, it just looks like they've got Protect on, and everything looks normal. You just don't think to do it again, but you had to do it repeatedly for it to stack. Now, again, I think this is just a poor mechanic. Yes, okay, maybe I didn't realize it for a long time, but even after I did, the way the game plays, I just don't think it's a good way to implement it. You have to stack it too many times for it to really start to show solid effect, and most of the battles are over too quickly, including the boss battles. And so one of the main battles where I had a chance to do it was stuff like the Brachioidos or whatever it was called, but they also had the black hole ability, so you could stack like 5 shells on each other to help reduce the damage, but then they already did the black hole move, so you got it removed anyway. So where in the game I was supposed to try to implement Shell and Protect in a really meaningful way, I didn't really understand. And again, I feel validated because that wasn't really something that you did in the later games either. You don't stack Protect in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So the fact that they didn't continue that mechanic either makes me think that yes, this was a mechanic that they weren't too happy with in the long term either, so it's something that they changed. So I think that kind of mechanic was something I didn't enjoy for sure, and because my playstyle does rely a lot on buffs, if you guys have seen, whenever I take on a boss or something, I like to play defensive first, so get my team set up, get my buffs on, and then go and start to attack. But with the way that this game was set up, I felt like I couldn't really be myself in battles as much as I wanted to. And so the harder battles were mostly ones where I didn't have the ability to defend myself or to kind of set up in the way that I wanted. It was more like, can I find loopholes or cheesy ways to kind of get through certain damage, super high damage dealing moves and stay alive in the battles and that kind of thing. So it wasn't kind of the style that I enjoyed in that sense. Another thing that just I was not happy with for a significant portion of the game was the amount of variation that you can do in terms of damage as a result of this like hit percentage and the attack multiplier aspects. I just did not like that. It became less and less relevant at higher levels because your percentage would be so high that you start to see more consistency in the damage you were doing. But earlier on in the game, it just made things unreliable and unpredictable in a bad way, I think. For me at least, I want to have a fairly reliable idea of what kind of damage that I'm doing for a given move. In this game, for significant portions of it, it felt like things just fluctuated so wildly because of the mechanics that I had no idea how much damage I was going to do or how much damage I was going to receive or like where I was at in terms of that stuff in the battle. So again, I don't think I remember looking through a stat menu, like a status menu or a stat menu in later Final Fantasies where I would see like, you know, accuracy percentage plus attack multiplier. They combine together to give you like some kind of damage output. I don't think I remember really seeing that kind of thing later on in the franchise. And to me, it wasn't really a good way to do it. So for that reason, there were times when I did less damage, even with the same character, and I wouldn't really understand why. And it just felt like, oh, that was just bad luck that time. Like, oh, I did 100 damage instead of 500. So I just never really liked it personally. It didn't work for me. And again, I felt like the later Final Fantasies, it's never something I've really had much of a complaint about. I think I've previously complained in the past maybe where enemies can hit you for very kind of obscenely different amounts. Like you can get 100 damage or you can get 1,000 damage from an enemy early on in the game. Maybe that can get a bit annoying sometimes, and that does filter through. But this whole idea of my party members having really wildly fluctuating damage in a way that I couldn't really predict for like a lot of the game, that's not something I really remember seeing as an issue before. I mean, you guys watching this would have probably watched a lot of my reviews and thoughts and feelings on Final Fantasy games before. I've never really mentioned anything like this before, so again, that's why I don't think it's just me just like completely making something up here and just seeing an issue where there wasn't one. I do think there is something there, and it's something I didn't appreciate when I was playing the game. Osmos and steel mechanics were shit. You guys saw it countless times in the playthrough. Again, with steel, partly my fault, because playing through the franchise, you start to learn pretty quickly that steel is useful. I used to get berated for not stealing. I remember, I think Final Fantasy 9, when I was playing through that one, people were yelling at me to make sure I steal because it's an important thing to do. And I think that's one thing where the community did eventually influence the way I play, and in a good way, because I started to realize that pretty much every Final Fantasy there is always good stuff to steal. So if you have characters that can do it, it's always a good practice to make sure that you're stealing. So I kind of trained myself to, well, no matter which Final Fantasy game I'm playing, if someone can steal, you should steal, because there's always a chance you pick up good shit. So when I got the steal ability here, and it came later on in the game, I was like rubbing my hands together thinking, yes, okay, I can get some good stuff now. And so again, having not researched the mechanics to this, I just started trying to steal like crazy, and it didn't work. And it didn't work, and it didn't work, and it didn't work, and you're just like, why doesn't it work? Like, is it because this enemy doesn't have anything to steal? Is it because it has a really rare steal that's super valuable? And again, while you're recording live, it's just something that you test and you just go with the flow and you just play. And so I kept stealing, and then of course it's the different situation where people who already know the steal mechanics are like, oh, for God's sake, this guy keeps stealing, he has no idea that he's basically wasting his time trying to steal, because if you're lower level than the enemy, there's only a 5% chance that you can steal in the first place, and then even when you do steal, it's like the more common items that you can steal. So it's just like, you know, you can't win, it's lose-lose in that sense. And so by the time I found out how the mechanics work myself, then I started to steal a lot less. But in general, again, steal mechanics like that is not something that I really experienced much of later in the game. And so I do think the steal mechanics were pretty shitty, and it was a bit of a waste really. They should have just made it a bit easier and worked with it better than they did. Osmos, completely shit. Again, you have pretty defined roles, so you don't have that many people that can cast magic anyway. And so when you do need magic, it's harder to spread it across multiple characters and to use everyone's MP. Ethers are not as easy to get for most of the game, and they don't heal for that much MP either. So when you put all of this stuff together, the Osmos mechanic is important for someone that's either a black mage or that's summoning, or something like that. And the way Osmos worked was shit. Again, almost impossible to tell if the enemy just simply didn't have any MP, or if they had it and they didn't want to give it to you, or whatever. I mean, I think back to the Arachne battle, where I Osmos 1 MP multiple times and I got a 40. So how are you supposed to use it like that? How are you supposed to know how it works? It's just, to me, it was really stupid. Even in the end game, when my characters were in like level 70s, there was a lot of stuff that I simply couldn't Osmos from, and it was pretty much the worst implementation, I think, of Osmos that I've seen in the franchise so far. And so in terms of all of that stuff, it just affects the way you play tactically and the way you approach the game. And if you've had 15-20 years worth of experience from Final Fantasy V onwards, you really do feel the impact of that when you go back to Final Fantasy IV and you try to play. So part of it on me because of the way I've approached it and that kind of thing. But again, given that Osmos mechanics often don't work like that later on in the franchise, I do think that the implementation sucked in this game, and it was something they fixed later on. The inventory thing is, to me, totally bullshit. When you have a cast of that size, and each person gets to equip 4 things, plus you have extra weapons and armors, and then all of the items that you can get in the game, like drops from enemies, from chests, from shops, all of that kind of stuff, it gets bloated very quickly, and it slows down your progress when you hit the limit. Now, you can say it teaches you resource management and all that kind of stuff, but the implementation, I think, was poor, and I feel validated in that because even in the 3D remake of the game, I'm told that there is none of that 48 item inventory bullshit. So even Square Enix themselves, when they were remaking their own game, they made sure they removed that. If they thought it was so useful in teaching players resource management, they would have kept it the same, or they would have only made it 64, or pretty much every Final Fantasy that came after it would also have had pretty strict limits on inventory. So no one can convince me that the 48 item inventory limit was a really good mechanic. I think it sucked. Fat Chocobo becoming summonable took way too long. That would have dealt with most of the situation if they allowed us to summon Fat Chocobo from anywhere in the game instead of having to return to the areas in which it can appear. So just in general, the implementation really was bad. Like, I think the Lunar Subterrane alone, there was something like 26 chests. Remember, you're at the end of the game right now, so you want to have as many items and as many things as possible to work your way through the hardest battles and the final bosses. So I think there was like 26 chests, not counting all of the spoils and steals from battle. So 48 was simply nowhere near enough to have a fluid experience with the game, like especially later game. It just sucked and it was genuinely bad. But now, we come to everyone's favourite gripe, and that is going to be the encounter rate. It was much too high. Not only that, there were too many back attacks and too many ambushes. At least if only one of them existed, you lowered the factor by a half. That would have helped, but no, we had back attacks and we had ambushes. There was a lot of battles where you would get back attacked and you'd have to face like 7 or 8 enemies at the same time. Like, the first time I saw it on screen, I thought it looked cool. Like, the fact that there was maybe 6 enemies on screen, 8 enemies. But then as the game went on and you had more and more encounters, having to get a back attack and wait for 8 enemies to all have their turns before you can move, oh my god, that was just absolutely horrific. It skewed the experience for me, and it skewed it in a big enough way that I would definitely drop a point out of 10 for it easily. Like, it was that bad. I just couldn't believe how high the encounter rates were sometimes, and it really got exhausting when I was trying to navigate new areas that had a lot of different rooms and a lot of different options. So Lunar Subterrane, Lunar Ruins, all of those kind of places. And to me, like, the game is such an adventure game. Final Fantasy to me is always an adventure. Like, get out there, go explore, see the world, try to find every room, try to find every chest, find all those hidden items and all that kind of stuff. When you have encounter rates that high, to me it just goes against the spirit of adventure and exploration. And so, to me, again, it was unforgivably bad in the game. And it's something that I was forced to mention frequently. I wish I didn't have to, but it really did grind my gears the further on I got in the game. And at times it just really got exhausting, and I did not enjoy it at all. They didn't even put in something like a no encounters accessory, a half encounters accessory, an accessory that stops ambushes and back attacks. Like, it was absolutely ruthless and absolutely relentless, and it was just punishing. It really was. So to me, in that respect, it was genuinely bad. It's something I've of course chatted to people about, like my friends. I've been on the stream. Of course, people that have been watching have been catching up with me in the stream, and they've of course also said the encounter rate is absolutely obscene. But again, a silver lining here might be the fact that this could be more specific to the PSP version, or maybe specifically even to emulating the PSP on a PC perhaps. Because there was at least one person I spoke to who said, for example, I'm playing the Pixel Remaster, and a lot of the things that you're upset about gameplay-wise in Final Fantasy IV PSP version, I'm not really experiencing any of those in my run. So I think, don't quote me on this, but I think they mentioned that they didn't have the inventory limit issue, and the encounter rate for them was a lot more acceptable as well. It definitely didn't look like my playthrough. So again, all of this stuff that I'm talking about is more specific to my experience on the PSP version. I couldn't really find any definitive information about encounter rates. I see people complaining about it, but I've never really seen anyone say, for example, I don't know, the encounter rate on the PSP version is an RNG number between 1 and 64 every step you take, but then in the Pixel Remaster is 1 in every 256, so you have 4 times less encounters. I've never seen any mechanics like that, so I can't objectively tell you which versions of the game have more or less encounters, but it's something I'm definitely curious to see in the 3D version of the game, to see if they've done something different for that. Even giving the player something to stop back attacks and ambushes would help so much, because you can run away pretty easily from the encounters, which is one plus point, but when the sheer number is that high, and 20-30% of them, maybe even more sometimes, felt like they were ambushes or back attacks where you can't run away until they're all done, then that pretty much kills the entire point, and it just makes it completely unbearable. So I had to end it with a rant about the encounter rate, because that was the biggest standout issue for me in the game. And I'm just hoping that, I really truly hope that the 3D version doesn't have it, or that other versions don't have it, or maybe even it was just this unlucky quirk of me playing on my PC and emulating it. Maybe something happens where, I don't know, the internal frame rate is higher, so it doubled my encounter rate without me realizing it. Maybe there's some weird technical reason why it happened, and maybe other people's playthroughs won't look like that. I truly hope that's the case. But again, based on how my playthrough went on the PSP version, the encounter rate and the implementation of encounters themselves were pretty rotten, and it did diminish my experience overall, unfortunately. So there we have it. That was a lot, but that's my general view of the PSP version of Final Fantasy IV. Overall, it is positive. I know I mentioned a lot of negative things, but like I say, I'm the kind of person that I always do my best to also point out the things that I didn't enjoy as much, but I try to give as much context as I can, and then give you an overall opinion on what I weight more heavily. So for this stuff, even though yes, I did mention a lot of negatives, when I look at the thing as a whole, and the context and all of those things, I do view Final Fantasy IV as a positive experience, and I did enjoy the game. And I still put it in the good tier of Final Fantasies. I wouldn't put it in the really great tier, definitely not in the A tier Final Fantasy 6 to Final Fantasy 10 group. I would definitely put it below that tier. Below that lies games like Final Fantasy 5, Final Fantasy 12, that kind of range. I'm more willing to put it within that kind of group. I think if I go back and I now play, I think maybe now if I were to play the 3D version of the game, or maybe find a version that caters a bit more to what I like, because now I know what I want out of my Final Fantasy IV experience, maybe then it will push it back up to that sort of borderline A tier, where it goes back up to that 8.5 out of 10 kind of range. And that's why it's been so difficult for me to review, because as a raw experience, it was positive and it was good, but I do feel like it could have been better if some of the context around it was different, and some of it I couldn't really control. So that's my general feeling about it. What I said once the credits started to roll still definitely applies. I have a lot of respect for this game. Very, very important game that really helped to lay the foundations of what Final Fantasy will become. And in terms of, if we're just talking about most important Final Fantasies ever made, I think Final Fantasy 1 for the fact that it is the first one ever made. Final Fantasy 7 because it felt like that was the one that really put Final Fantasy on the map on a global scale. It is the biggest and most iconic release of the franchise. I would probably put Final Fantasy 4 in that top 3, I would say. It sounds like it was extremely important. It was a lot of people's first Final Fantasy game. It sounds like it was the first game that really set the formula up for what would happen later on in the franchise. It was a bigger cast. They tried to have more of a real story. That's the kind of things that I've been hearing. And because I know so many people love this game, and I try my best to empathize and to think back to the first games that I played, or even imagine being, in my early teens in 1991 when this game came out, and I just happened to try it for the first time. I feel like a lot of the stuff that I mentioned, negatively, I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't even realize a lot of that stuff. I would completely gloss over it. I just wouldn't care, and I would get completely hooked in on the adventure and the cast of Final Fantasy IV, and it would blow me away. And for years to come, it would always be one of my favorite Final Fantasy games. I do truly believe that could have happened, and that's why when people tell me that Final Fantasy IV is their favorite or one of their top 3 titles, for me that's not, based on what I've seen, that's not a hot take. But in the year 2022, trying to play 2D versions of Final Fantasy IV, especially if you've never played Final Fantasy IV before, I think it's very difficult. I can't imagine too many people that would have had the same position that I did, where they've never played a Final Fantasy IV game before, but they have a lot of experience with the rest of the franchise. For them to go back this year to play Final Fantasy IV for the first time on a blind run, complete the PSP version, and then to say, I think Final Fantasy IV is better than Final Fantasy 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all of those games, let's say. To me, that is a hot take. For someone who played it back in the day, it's not a hot take, but for someone that's playing it for the first time, in this day and age, I just can't see how that's possible. I don't see how you can think it's better than Final Fantasy VI, or it's better than, like, you know, collectively 7, 8, 9, and 10. I just don't see it. Not for the year 2022 in the state that the 2D versions of the game are in. The 3D one perhaps has translated that gameplay better, where you still pretty much have the same kind of story, but you do have the gameplay tweaks and enhancements that make it feel a bit more familiar, and it is not really as annoying and as ancient as the kind of experience that I had with Final Fantasy IV in the year 2022. That's what I'm talking about. This game and this, like, you know, assessment is so much of like, well, if it was like this, or if it was like that, or because of this context, because of that context, it's really difficult to pin down this game in that sense. So yeah, I hope you still enjoyed it anyway. I tried to share my thoughts as clearly as I could with you, broke it down into some context at the start, gave you guys the good, gave you guys the bad, and then some overall assessment on the end. Hope you guys enjoyed the playthrough anyway, even if it grated on you sometimes, the kind of stuff that I wasn't really noticing, and like the assumptions and the muscle memory and the brain memory that I had from all of the other titles manifesting in a bad way in Final Fantasy IV. It did teach me a few lessons. There are a few things I will try to do for Final Fantasy III, like things I wouldn't have thought to research previously, that I'm going to try to look into to have less of that happening. I'm never going to be able to completely get rid of that, but I think there are some steps I can take to hopefully make that a little less of a factor than they were for Final Fantasy IV, because there were just too many weird things going on that I couldn't put my finger on what was happening, or that I completely didn't notice, or didn't really know how to implement. Hopefully that's going to be less of a thing in Final Fantasy III, but we'll just have to see how it goes. So for now, it's a very busy time on the channel. It's going to be very busy in terms of new Final Fantasy content as well, which is something that hasn't happened for an extremely long time. I mean, we got the remaster for Crisis Core finally coming. Winter 2022, we don't know exactly when that's going to be, but a lot of smart money is on early 2023 for that one. Then we have summer 2023 for Final Fantasy 16, and then we have winter 2023 for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, so like aka Remake Part 2. That is a ton of big Final Fantasy projects coming up, and so how I'm going to fit my playthroughs of Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3 around that, at this point I'm not entirely sure. Of course, we're not going to be done here. Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3 are going to get played in backwards order, so Final Fantasy 3 will come next. But at what stage I'll do that exactly, I'm not sure. I want to map things out so I don't create these silly traffic jams, because 2022 was a pretty bad year for that. I took on 2 incredibly huge games, and it created the kind of schedule and clash that I really didn't end up liking later on. So I'm going to be a lot more careful with when I play certain things, and so you guys will have to look out for that on the channel. Just stay tuned. Make sure you don't miss any hangouts that happen, or community posts and that kind of thing, and hopefully you'll be able to stay up to date with the latest Final Fantasy content that will be coming to the channel. So thank you all so much for taking the time to watch my playthrough of Final Fantasy IV. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope to see you guys for future playthroughs on the channel. Thank you for watching. Take care.